Now we're going to review section 3 of chapter 1 that examines basically the characteristics of life, among other things. So, what are those basic characters? What traits do all living things share? Um, well, first of all, living things are made of cells. Cells are the basic units of life, we would say. And if you don't have cells, you don't have a living thing. For example, our desks are made of matter, material, plastic and metal, but they're not made of cells, so they're not alive. Um, Living things share a universal code of DNA. That is, all living things have DNA, which is the material they use to transmit information from one generation to the next. It provides the code that makes us what we are, color of our hair, our eyes, and all that kind of good stuff. Um, we're going to spend later on quite a bit of time talking about DNA, but this is again something that all living things share. There's some DNA, a cartoonish image of it. All living things have to acquire materials and energy to do what they do, to grow, to reproduce, just to have a metabolism to keep them going. And so they have to have ways of acquiring these materials and energy. And there's a lot of variation on that theme. Of course, plants obtain their energy from sunlight. We obtain it from eating food. Um, so they all have to do that. All living things, to a certain extent, grow and develop. They start out as immature forms and then become juvenile forms. In the case of an insect, they are known as larvae. And they become the adult form later on. Um, So even a bacterium, a simple thing like a bacterium, starts out as a relatively small cell and grows into a larger cell. Of course, all living things have to reproduce. You might even, this is sometimes described as the biological imperative, or maybe the purpose of life, or at least one of the purposes of life, is to make new individuals, to make the next generation. In the case of bacteria, to make copies of yourself, to keep the species going. So all things reproduce one way or another. All living things interact with their surroundings. They're not these isolated individuals. Again, one way we do that, of course, is by eating. We take in food and energy. Here, this lizard is essentially absorbing heat from the sun. It just sits on this rock and it's just heating its body up that way because reptiles are what we call cold-blooded animals. They don't have a very high metabolism, so they can't generate a lot of heat, so they basically absorb it from their surroundings. Um, Another way, think if you're too hot, you might go sit in the shade. Again, you're responding to your external conditions um, to make yourself more comfortable, you might say. And that leads us to this notion of homeostasis. And this is where we're using sometimes chemical reactions in us, our metabolism, other times behavioral reactions, like I said, going into the shade. And we're doing this attempting to maintain relatively constant conditions inside us, whether it's our, of course, body temperature is a big one. And so we have different ways of doing this. If we're too hot, we sweat. If we're too cold, we shiver, and we shiver, which are involuntary muscle contractions, to generate heat. And this is analogous to what we have in our home with a thermostat that will turn the furnace on when the house is cold and turn it off once the temperature comes up. Or as we are now in the summertime, once the house gets too hot, the air conditioner kicks in to cool it down, again, to maintain relatively constant conditions inside your house. Um, like I said, body temperature is a good one. The pH of your body fluids, um, sugar levels in your blood. There's all sorts of examples, and we'll talk about more of those later when we talk about metabolism. Um, Living things evolve, and so here you can see this is the, if you will, the hypothesized family of horses looking at the fossil record. They've gotten larger over time. And one thing we want to keep in mind with this process that is changing over time is that this is what happens to species, not individuals. Individuals do not evolve, but species evolve by typically minor modifications from one generation to the next over time, um, and ideally evolving to have a better fit with one's environment, being able to survive better, reproduce better, all those things that living things need to do. So again, keep that in mind. Species evolve, individuals do not. Now, some other themes listed in this section, structure and function. So when we look at living things and the structure that they have, typically those structures are not just random, but they have a particular function. You know, the wings of birds are a very clear example. They have the function of flying, or whether it's the wings of butterflies or flies. You know, something like fur on an animal is just, again, not this random trait, but of course is a trait that helps keep them warm. And of course, animals that live in colder environments tend to have thicker fur. Or if you live way far north where there's lots of snow and ice, you might have white fur, and that the function of that white fur, of course, is to blend in with the snow. So when we look at animals and plants and whatever the organism might be, again, we have to think of the structures that they have as having a particular function, and that structure has been molded, that structure has been molded over time by the evolutionary process, again, to make that organism have a better fit with its surroundings. So we can see the various organisms we're looking at here. There's a lot of course, diversity out there, as you know. But again, these main characteristics of life make us all similar to a certain extent. Again, you know, we all share DNA, we all have cells, and the cell structure is, you know, pretty similar. We share certain types of reactions amongst all living things, and we're going to talk about cellular respiration later, and we'll see that's a process that's found throughout many, many different types of organisms, and there are others that just have variations on that theme. Because again, all living things need to process foods they either make for themselves in the case of plants, or foods that they eat in our case. Life out there, again, organisms interact with their environment, but they also interact with each other. So as we see in this food web, there's a lot of interconnections between organisms, and the grasshopper's eating the grass, and some type of mouse is eating this grasshopper, and then the fox eats the mouse, or the hawk eats the mouse. And so no species, no individual is an island. They're always interacting with each other in various ways. Now on pages 22 and 23, we don't necessarily need to memorize these, but you just want to be aware, as you probably know, there's of course many fields within biology, and I'm sure you could think of some. You could be a biochemist, or you could study genetics, or you could be an ecologist. There's any number. You can be essentially, I like to think of medical doctors essentially as biologists who focus on studying people and the diseases and conditions and problems we have, and of course figuring out ways to help people and get them all healthy. So many different kinds of fields. Now, last but not least, we just have a little review here of the metric system, which, as you probably know, is in science is the system we generally use. We sort of frown using inches, and we stick with centimeters or meters, or in larger scale kilometers when we're measuring things. This is sort of as we see here, the international system of measuring things. And as you know, it's based on units of 10, and so there are 10 millimeters in a centimeter, for example. And of course, the meter is what we use to measure length. The gram or kilogram is what we use to measure mass. And we have liters to measure volume, and we use the Celsius scale to measure temperature, which, as you probably know, is based on a scale from 0 to 100, with 0 being the freezing point, 100 being the boiling point. So we'll want to think about this system as the one we're going to use, and we'll review it a bit more in class about the different units. Between centimeters and meters, there are other units that aren't typically used so much, but we'll talk about those a little bit in class. The very last section of the book, or this section, talks about safety. And there's an appendix in the book, I believe it's Appendix A12, which talks all about safety. And we have not really done a lab yet, but as we get to where we're going to do a lab, we will review those pages in the appendix, and we'll even have a quiz on that, on lab safety, to make sure you review that stuff. Okay, we'll do that a little later though. Okay, there it is. That's the last section of Chapter 3.